Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're watching from. We're happy you're here. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome back, and many thanks to tonight's guest, Ann Applebaum. Thank you for taking the time during this crucial week when I know you're probably under a lot of pressure and very busy. Time to talk to our audience about the impact of this election on the Ukraine, on the Middle East, and on our U.S. foreign policy more generally. And thanks as well to our moderator, the wonderful Larry Mantle. Our final program before this crucial election will be next Monday on election eve. We will be treated to what will be a great conversation between Lynn Vavreck, a political scientist who teaches American politics and public policy at UCLA, and Norm Ornstein, Senior Fellow Emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute, the conservative think tank. Lynn Vavreck is an expert in campaigns and elections and has written many books on the subject, including one on the 2012 and another on the 2016 presidential campaigns, both of which received critical acclaim. At the American Enterprise Institute, Norm has been studying politics, elections, and the U.S. Congress for more than 4 decades and might be the most knowledgeable person in the country about all aspects of the U.S. Congress. Whether from other books he has written, aside from the other books he has written, Norm co-founded and co-wrote the go-to reference guide that provides impartial data for congressional watchers. The guide is updated every 2 years and is considered a type of Bible with vital statistics about Congress and its members. We gave a lot of thought about who we should invite for election eve and are confident that it will be a great discussion moderated by Pat Morrison. Then for our election postmortem, the week after Election Day, the extremely knowledgeable and highly respected Ron Brownstein will join us. We here are convinced that Ron has encyclopedic knowledge of all aspects of campaigns and results in probably every voting district in the United States. So he will have lots to share with us as the results of next Tuesday's election become clear. We purposely decided to wait until the week after Election Day for our post-election program to give the dust time to settle. That program is on Monday, November 11th, and then on Wednesday, November 13th, we will host Jason Tietenhoff, a former member of and former spokesperson of the far-right paramilitary group, the Oath Keepers, whose members were involved in the January 6th insurrection. Jason testified against the Oath Keepers before the House Select Committee on January 6th, and it will be a very important conversation with Larry Mantle on the ominous topic of the perils of extremism, how I left the Oath Keepers, and why we should be worried about another civil war. As Election Day approaches, if you are anything like me, you are anxious and concerned. You can use your anxious energy to vote, to get others to vote, and if you have time and capacity, you can phone bank or walk precincts to help with voter turnout. There are still volunteer opportunities. Some of those are on our website under the activism tab, or call your favorite candidate's campaign and offer to help get out the vote. Now, to introduce tonight's guest and to lead our discussion, please welcome the incomparable Larry Mantle, an LA NPR radio legend for almost 4 decades and a treasured moderator for America at a Crossroads. Larry, welcome and thank you.
Janice, thank you so much. Your words always mean a lot to me. I appreciate you and Mel and Zeb so much. It's always an honor to be part of America at a Crossroads, and I'm particularly looking forward to tonight's conversation with Ann as we are 6 days away from the momentous November 5th election. Many of us are on edge, as you were just mentioning, Janice, all the twists and turns that are likely ahead. And I find it helpful to talk with someone like our guest, Ann Applebaum, who's deeply knowledgeable, who can ground our concerns in what she's learned over decades of studying history and democracy. And where introducing me is pretty short, I've been the same place 40 years. Ann's experience is vast and varied. I'll just give you the thumbnail. She's written extensively about the history of communism and democratic developments in Eastern and Central Europe. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning 2003 book, Gulag, A History, looked at Soviet prison camps and worked for The Economist and The Spectator. She's currently a staff writer for The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Agora Institute of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And we do very much appreciate you being with us this evening. Welcome again to America at a Crossroads.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with this group. I think the third time, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's great. And as a former member of the Washington Post editorial board that you are, I have to ask you what you think of first owner Jeff Bezos's decision to forego a presidential endorsement so close to election day.
I feel really sad about it, I have to tell you, mostly because I know how devastating this is for colleagues, not just on the editorial board or on the newsroom or in the newsroom, because the way this was done, the decision to do it just a few days before the election, certainly gave the impression, although Jeff Bezos has now denied it, that the point of essentially blocking an endorsement that had already been written was to somehow kowtow to the next Trump presidency if it should come to be. And all of the excuses that have been given and written don't suffice to explain that away or to make people feel better. And newspapers, especially nowadays, but I think it was always true, function because people trust them. People think that that the journalists are acting in good faith, that they're trying to find out real information, that when an editorial board, which is of course separate from the news team, makes a recommendation, it's based on their reporting and their work that they've done over years, that it matches the views of the board, which you can read in many previous editorials. And when you break that faith, when suddenly the owner makes what appears to be a whimsical decision going against the staff, I'm afraid it reduces trust in the institution. I
Well,
don't know who Bezos thinks reads the Post or who he thinks could ever read it, but this was not a way to encourage readership. And some of you might know that the story is something like 250,000 people have canceled their subscriptions, which is about 10% of the current subscriber base. But I mean, it's really devastating. It's very, very
well,
sad.
and it seems bizarre, and given that for the 4 years Trump was in office, the Washington Post was every day just filled with stories critiquing the Trump administration and everything that it was doing. That is the brand, that's the identity of the Washington Post. So it makes this all the stranger as even if that is the motivation on his part to somehow um, kowtow to the former president. I mean, the whole record with the Post is the opposite of
I mean,
that.
it's also, of course, had there been an endorsement of Harris a week ago, nobody would have noticed or paid any attention. I
Right.
mean, it would have been expected that, I mean, maybe that's also bad, but I mean, it wouldn't have made news in any case. It might have reassured readers, or people might have read it to see exactly how they did it or what they said. But it wouldn't have
Yeah.
made a news story. This did make a news story. And I think it's triggered a deeper fear. I mean, this is, of course, what it meant to me, that of people obeying a potentially autocratic or I don't know, I'm trying to think of the better word, or potentially norm breaking and rule breaking presidency in advance. So people are afraid that Trump will be vengeful, that when he becomes president, or if he becomes president for the second time, that he will be focused on taking revenge and getting even with his enemies, that he will use the power of the White House not on behalf of the American people, but that he will do it in order to get even with people who he's angry at and to curry favor with people that he likes. And that's what people are afraid of that. And Bezos' gesture just made people more afraid that that will be the case. I mean, it had the effect of reinforcing a kind of nebulous anxiety that people have about a second Trump term.
And the op-ed, the essay that he wrote, just seemed to further confuse things and be even more poorly received.
Well,
But
what was
but I
curious about the essay he wrote was that he said rightly that journalists are losing their trust of many people. But first of all, why are they losing that trust? And that's because there's a concerted, organized, careful campaign against them, to make people who do real reporting and who do fact checking, to make them lose their credibility, to frame them in a way that their whatever they do is seen as biased. And secondly, Bezos's own action helped to reduce that credibility further. I mean, it suddenly made the paper seem even more untrustworthy. So it was a very strange essay.
Well, let's move on to talk about these foreign policy issues. So much of the attention in the presidential race has been on economic issues, domestic policy. We're going to focus your particular area of expertise, international relations and NATO, Ukraine, Gaza. But I want to ask you about sort of the overall move that we're seeing in parts of Europe, elsewhere in the world. We have Viktor Orban, prime minister in Hungary, highly nationalistic parties in Europe. What is fueling, in your view, this disillusionment with liberal democracy?
Well, so to be clear, other than Orban, there aren't, I guess maybe the Slovaks, although that's a sort of a strange case. There aren't any governments in Europe that are, that are led by autocratic populists or who are openly anti-democratic. That parties who are opposed to more immigration do well in elections, or that parties who have a cultural critique of existing norms do well in elections is not necessarily by itself worrying. I mean, what is worrying is political parties who come to power with an agenda of undermining the state, capturing the state, corrupting the state. And I think we should draw a line between people who have views we don't agree with, which we can fight with and argue about, and people who are running political movements that are designed to end or curtail democracy. And the one political leader in Europe who is famous for doing that is Viktor Orban. You've mentioned him already. He is an aggressively right-wing leader, but his agenda in office has been focused on doing what he can to make sure that he never loses power. So whether it's through curtailing the judiciary, whether it's through attacking and undermining the media, something he did, by the way, not through censorship, but through threatening advertisers, seeking to bankrupt papers who opposed him. What he did was essentially create a media landscape where there wasn't any opposition other than a few fairly small websites. So he had a clear agenda to alter Hungary's democratic system. And at least until recently, he had support for doing that for a variety of reasons. I mean, he camouflaged what he was doing behind an argument about preserving Hungarianness. Some of what he said, saying that he was fighting a wave of immigration that was fictitious, it didn't actually exist. He was very good at using populist language, but again, what's worrying about him and his example is not so much his rhetoric, but his actions, his attempt to squeeze out political opposition and make it impossible to lose.
And you don't really have concerns about some of those immigration restrictionist, nationalistic parties elsewhere that they would have a similar agenda?
So I mean, you have to distinguish between places where immigration is a real problem, like there are lots of people arriving and there's an issue about what to do with them and it's hard to know how to process them. And I mean, there's a mass immigration problem especially in Southern European countries that's real. And then there's an immigration issue in places like Hungary, for example, which is fake. There's no mass immigration into Hungary. Immigration is used rather as a symbolic issue. It's a symbol of the the other coming in to undermine our society. It's what people focus on when they're afraid of other kinds of change. I mean, I think that this is something I talked a lot about in my previous book that was published a few years ago. We are living through an era of really remarkable and profound and rapid change. And so that's not just political change or economic change, it's also social change, it's demographic change, it's cultural change, it's change in the way that we relate to each other, the way in which we get and process information about the world. We get our news in these fast chunks and tidbits. We speak to one another via apps and chats. And whenever you have periods in history when you have huge amounts of change, you have people wanting things to slow down. You have people looking backwards. You have nostalgia. You have people wanting something simpler. You know, we want a single leader. We don't want all this cacophony. We don't want all this noise. We don't want all this debate. We just want one idea. And so you are seeing people being attracted to political parties who use that language. And again, I would separate that a little bit from the phenomenon of immigration, about which there can, reasonable people can disagree
Sure.
about what the policy.
UK, a prime example of that. We're very vigorous debate on that issue. So let's talk about former President Trump and what you would see if he's elected. What sorts of efforts would you see him making to undo longstanding alliances with other countries? We already had a very contentious relationship with NATO during his first term. What sorts of initiatives, based on what he said and what you saw him do back during his first term, do you think would preview for his second term?
So Trump is not very consistent about many things, but he's been very consistent about 2 or 3 things back for 30 years since the 1980s. He has been consistent in his dislike of allies and alliances, and he has been consistent in his desire for high tariffs. I mean, these are things he's talked about for a long time. Because he is a transactional person, meaning that he's somebody who is really interested in himself and his own power and maybe his own money or his family's money or his entourage's money. It's hard to predict what he'll do, because he will do in any given situation whatever seems advantageous to him. But I think we can say pretty definitively that he's not interested in alliances. He's not interested in pulling together coalitions. There will not be a coalition to fight kleptocracy, which is one of the things I argue in my more recent book that there should be. There will not be a coalition to reform or regulate the internet. There may not be a coalition to make sure that Ukraine wins the war. At the moment, I don't think most Americans know this, but the majority of the money and weapons that go into Ukraine right now are coming from Europe, actually, not the United States. The United States, though, is of course a crucial component. We have more stuff. We have intelligence that we give the Ukrainians, and our contribution matters enormously. But we are part of a broad coalition. It includes about 50 countries. It was created by Biden and his defense secretary. And I don't see Trump being able to lead that or being interested in leading that into the future. So I don't see him working with allies on the basis of mutual interest or values. And that's not something he's ever been interested in doing. And so the consequences for NATO, again, he could decide that he wants to be a tough guy and he's going to show Putin. I don't know. I mean, he said several times, "I'll end the war in one day." Nobody knows what that means. And there are different people around him who are giving different interpretations. You can find people who say that means he'll accelerate the war. You can find people who say it means he'll announce that we're leaving Ukraine, as soon as he takes office. So I don't know exactly what it means. But it does mean that he will act not in the interest of Ukraine, not in the interest of pushing back against the alliance of autocracies who are now fighting there and who are working with Russia to defeat Ukraine. He will not work in favor of establishing, any kind of order in the world or any kind of, or strengthening or promoting or defending democracy, because those aren't things that he's interested in.
If his stated goal is to end the war, and he says he would do that immediately, what is there a realistic concern that he would pressure a deal between Zelensky and Putin that would call on Zelensky ceding significant amount of territory, which he wouldn't accept?
Well, no, here's the problem with asking Zelensky to concede territory. I mean, we probably could persuade Zelensky to concede territory. The trouble is, it is not Zelensky who is preventing the end of the war. It is Putin and the Russians who don't want to end the war. So right now, they believe that they can grind Ukraine down and eventually take the whole country. So their goals, their stated goals, which they repeat frequently on their propaganda television, but also in diplomacy, repeatedly, they keep saying their goal is to occupy or one way or the other control all of Ukraine. They have not given that up. So to end the war, you have to convince them to stop fighting. So Zelensky could concede territory, but why would the Russians stop there? Why would they say, okay, now we have Donetsk, we're stopping there. Why wouldn't they continue? Why wouldn't they move on to Zaporizhia or Kharkiv or eventually Kiev? That argument about Zelensky conceding territory is very strange. And people have been saying it almost since the beginning of the war. And I've never fully understood what people mean by it or understand by it, because there is right now no evidence that Putin wants to end the war. And so what Trump means, I don't know. I mean, he sometimes says things without them meaning anything in particular. So I don't know exactly what, what that means.
If the U.S. significantly cut or stopped its support for Ukraine, even with Western Europe providing the majority of the funding, could Ukraine continue to hold off Russia, or would that be impossible?
It's hard to say. I mean, they would do it. I mean, for the Ukrainians, remember that they're fighting the war because if they don't fight the war, then they will be occupied. And what does occupation mean? Occupation means arbitrary arrests. It means concentration camps. It means that their children will be kidnapped and taken to Russia and given Russian names. This has happened to 20,000 Ukrainian children. It means they will be subjected to a totalitarian regime of a kind we haven't seen in Europe since the 1930s. When reports come out of what occupied Ukraine looks like, it's not unlike occupied Poland under the Nazi state, for example. So the Ukrainians are, it's pretty existential. I mean, for them to not fight, it doesn't mean, if they don't stop fighting, it doesn't mean that they have peace. It means that they have a vicious and brutal occupation regime in which their identity is stripped away. Many of them will die. There will be mass arrests. I mean, and I'm saying this this is not theoretical. This is what has already happened. It's what happened when Russia took Crimea. It's what happened when they took Donetsk. It's what happened in this 2022 when they took parts of the Kherson region and other pieces of eastern Ukraine. When they take over Ukraine, they bring this regime of terror. So the Ukrainians will fight until they can't fight anymore, because the alternative is just a different form of death. So us not helping them would simply mean that more people die.
So sort of if the former president were to be elected and US support was to be cut or eliminated for Ukraine, what do you anticipate would be the public response here to seeing increasing casualties of Ukrainian forces, seeing land potentially taken by Russian troops? What sorts of pressure would you see being brought to bear on Congress, for example?
I mean, the majority of Americans continue to support Ukraine. I mean, I suppose particularly this week, not people aren't as focused on it as they were, but all the polling shows that. All the polling shows that people don't want Ukrainians abandoned. There would be distress and pressure, but if Trump were in the White House, I'm not sure how much. Also, Trump does win, and if he wins significantly, then I imagine he would control the House and the Senate as well. I mean, the Senate it's a difficult year for the Senate anyway, from the Democratic point of view. And so, people who cared about Ukraine would have very little influence. I mean, maybe they would have, there would still be charities and there would be other ways to donate or to help, but it would be limited what we could do.
I was just going to say, if the vice president was elected, would you see a continuation of the current U.S. policy toward Ukraine?
So I have to assume that Harris would. Harris has said several times, and she said it very eloquently, actually, both during the debate and during her speech at the convention last summer. She has talked very eloquently and clearly about being the leader of the democracies in the world, about maintaining the role of America as a coalition leader and as a country that has strong allies. Remember, we have important allies not just in Europe but also in Asia. We have important relationships in Africa and Latin America. So it's not just this is not just about NATO. And so I have to assume that whoever she appoints as Secretary of State and, and Defense, Secretary of Defense. And I've heard various names, people throw around names in Washington, but actually, of course, nobody really knows what she would do, is that she would push in that direction. I mean, as it happens, I've met Harris a couple of times, and both times it was as part of conversations about Ukraine. She was preparing, visits or meetings, and she asked to meet with people who know about that subject. And a couple of times I was asked, and she's knowledgeable and interested. She understood the significance of what was happening. She's met Zelensky several times. It's not her area of expertise, but remember that she's a prosecutor, so she's somebody who's interested in the rule of law. And she may be even somebody who understands that one of the purposes of Putin invading Ukraine was to destroy any remaining idea of rule of law in international relations. So Putin was saying, I can do this, you can't stop me. None of your rules or your norms about not changing borders in Europe by force, none of this applies anymore. I can do whatever I want. And she may be someone who understands how dangerous that is, not just in Europe, but around the world. Yuval Harari has this. Now I don't remember the statistics, but he has a very good description of what the world was like before we had some kind of liberal order. It meant countries had to spend 50% of their budget on the military. Because if you were a small country, you might be invaded, because war was a constant and omnipresent possibility. And for the last several decades, certainly since 1945, that hasn't been true. And so we've been able to spend money on welfare and education and improving the lives of citizens. And we have this idea that prosperity should be the goal of government, whereas in prior eras and prior generations, the goal of the government was to fight wars on behalf of the country's sovereignty, or else, with the goal of winning colonies in other places. And so, a return to that kind of world, a world in which there weren't any norms, in which countries invaded one another periodically and regularly, as was the case in Europe, in the past, would be a pretty radical change. For most of us, we would be living in a different world. Our governments would have different kinds of priorities, and it's possible that we could be heading towards that kind of world again.
We, of course, saw with the invasion of Crimea that the U.S., didn't really step in, and so now the U.S. has to assist Ukraine in its efforts. And I wondered, what sort of changed in the dynamic back from the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula, and is there a potential for us to go back to that sort of place where we, as a country, would tolerate some level of that?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but I mean, the problem with following the invasion of Crimea was that we put some sanctions on Russia for a while, but then essentially we went back to business as usual. And this was particularly particularly true. It wasn't just an American policy. It was the Germans immediately went back to building this infamous pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany. And so the feeling that Putin got was, oh, okay, I can invade another country and break all these rules, and actually I don't really pay any price for it. And so the mistake we made after Crimea was not to make the Russians pay a price.
And that's kind of my point, so we tolerated that essentially as a country, like, well, that's a bad thing. Russia shouldn't do that, but it was tolerated, as opposed to the more recent invasion that's now been going on, for which we've been providing arms and financial support.
Yeah, I mean, had Ukraine been armed after 2014, there wouldn't have been an invasion in 2022, or it would have been much less likely. I mean, one of the reasons Ukraine was invaded was it appeared to be weak and unarmed. I mean, actually, the Ukrainian army was better than most people understood. But yeah, I mean, there wasn't an attempt to arm and defend Ukraine after 2014, and the result was a second invasion.
What effect do you see, particularly on our NATO allies between the two candidates if they're elected? If it's Harris, is it business as usual with those alliances? Is it Trump? They worry about their security. What do you see how do those countries respond?
So almost every country in Europe has had a, group of people quietly and secretly planning for what happens if Trump wins. And there are different scenarios. I mean, there are people who are talking about buying U.S. weapons. There are people who are looking at creating different kinds of security alliances more deeply connected to the European Union, for example. I mean, I don't know that there are any really very good ideas or any forward-looking plans, and people are kind of waiting to see. I mean, also remember, again, I'll repeat what I just said. I mean, nobody really knows what Trump will do because as I said, he doesn't have an ideology. He just has he has a he has a personality and he has instincts, and how those will be channeled, we can't say. And there is some, maybe it's wishful thinking that from people who say, well, he won't want to be humiliated by Putin, and so he'll continue fighting the war. But I mean, it's true that there is a bigger concern down the line. And if Russia, not just if it wins the war, but if the war ends in a way that Russia feels triumphant in any way, then it is very likely that at some point in the future, the Russians will challenge NATO. They'll attack or undermine or otherwise, they're maybe try some kind of hybrid invasion of a NATO country, and then wait to see how NATO would react. And so they're beginning to be European plans for what they would do. And of course, there is a fear that the U.S. wouldn't react. I mean, of course, the U.S. is also very important because the U.S. was, in effect, with the Britain and France do have very small nuclear arsenals, but the U.S. has been the dominant nuclear power, and it has been assumed for several decades that the U.S. would use its nuclear weapons to one way or the other to defend Europe. If people didn't believe that was true anymore, then you might begin to see a proliferation of nuclear weapons. I mean, that would be true both in Europe, and it would also be true in Asia.
I just want to remind our viewers that we'll be taking questions very shortly, so please feel free in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to enter a question. Please make it as concise as you can. We'd appreciate that, and feel free to include your first name and the location from where you're viewing the program. And you mentioned one of the points of consistency of Donald Trump is his belief in tariffs as a way of protecting American industries and the jobs of American workers. But it's unclear how much of this is threat, is negotiating ploy, and how much of this he would really seek to enact far-reaching tariffs. Do you have any sense one way or the other? And if he does, with the assistance of Congress, enact wide-ranging tariffs, what would you see the effect be on our allies?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I know that tariffs are very inflationary. I know that they gum up and slow down and make trade more difficult and more expensive. Depending on which tariffs we're talking about in which countries, obviously there would be very different effects. But it's true that tariffs that were specifically directed at Europe, which is something also Trump does talk about, would create a greater distancing and anger in Europe. I mean, one thing to remember is that and I have to put this delicately because I don't want it to sound threatening, but there could be a moment when Europeans say, the United States is so hostile to us and has announced that it's not part of our defense anymore. It's seeking to undermine us with tariffs. I mean, of course, by the way, there would be counter tariffs, so it would then be more difficult for U.S. companies to do business in Europe. So you would have that, but you would begin to hear Europeans saying, well, actually, we do a lot of business with China. Maybe we should have better relations with them. I mean, you would find that right now there is still broadly speaking, the democratic world, Europe, America, the Asian democracies have a unified attitude towards, more or less, and there are a lot of nuances, towards China and towards Chinese trade. And the Europeans, for example, have been willing to listen to the US when the US said that doing deals with Huawei, the Chinese company, was a security threat. I mean, the British had invested actually quite a lot in Huawei, and they rolled that back on the advice and under some pressure from the US to do that. You might find that people begin to say, well, why are we doing that? If we have a security threat from the United States, we have a security threat from Russia, maybe the Chinese are a better ally. And I'm just speculating for anybody who's listening. I'm not saying this will happen, but I mean, you will begin to have people ask, okay, if the US is not our friend anymore, what does that mean? We need some allies somewhere else, or we need Fortress Europe, or we need to put new protective walls around ourselves, or we need to keep out US industry. I mean, it's not as if this would be a no-cost effort. I mean, it's not as if the United States can just put tariffs on people and have it not reverberate on the US economy. We've had that, it's happened in history before.
Looking at the intervention efforts of other countries, how significant do you see it? You've got Iran, who is trying to damage the Trump candidacy, Russia, of course, trying to damage the Harris candidacy. What do these amount to, in your view?
It's very hard to say right now. I don't know enough about what has been done. I mean, the Russian effort to influence US politics is very long-standing and very deep, and goes very well, much beyond just the election of Trump. We had a glimpse of it a few weeks ago, last summer, when the Department of Justice revealed an investigation into a influencer group in Tennessee. This is a group of people who make YouTube videos, who, kind of far-right videos. I mean, some of them were about Russia and Ukraine and the various conspiracy theories about Ukraine and the Ukrainians supposedly being behind an ISIS terrorist attack in Moscow, that kind of thing. But they also, a lot of them were about US politics. They were far-right narratives inside the US. And these are very popular. They had hundreds of thousands of views. And it turned out that RT, which is the Russian state television, was paying $100,000 per video to this group. And if you know anything about journalism, that's a lot of money. That's a lot more money than most people make earn by making videos. And it was pretty transparent that it was coming, and it was kind of mysterious investor with a kind of Euro-Armenian name, and it wasn't clear where the money was from. And it seems as if the team running this media company knew what it was from. But I mean, that's just one example of the many, many ways in which the Russians have been funding openly and covertly far right and extremists, and maybe also far left, by the way, because they're not ideological in that sense. Propaganda and ideas. Sometimes they do it openly, sometimes they do it under their own name. Sometimes they engage in what's called information laundering. They create fake websites that look to be something else, but are really run by them or influenced by them or paid for by them. And so they have there's a very, very long game that they've been playing in the US and US politics going back to before 2016, actually, I mean, 2015, 2014. The Iranians seem to be more ad hoc, and it seems more recent, and they have a few hackers. It's not clear to me what their long-term goal is. I don't know what, other than a bit of electoral disruption. I don't see what their big strategy is. I mean, maybe it'll become clear in time, but it's clear what the Russian strategy is. I should also say that in recent months, the Chinese have begun playing some of the same games as the Russians, probably just to learn how, probably just as an experiment, creating fake social media accounts, putting up extremist language. I think if you remember the fire in Hawaii some months ago, immediately after that fire, there was a Chinese group that tried to start conspiracy theories about the fire that somebody uncovered. And it looks like these things are experiments. I mean, the Chinese historically haven't.
It's not to influence a particular candidate or policy. It's
no,
just
it's not about
disruptive.
It's not about candidates and policies. It's about creating distrust and creating social unrest and making people feel distance and anger and anxiety from the political system. It's about it's more foundational. It's not necessarily about one candidate. It's about the autocratic effort inside democracies is more about loosening the bonds that people feel to their government and to their political system.
And
And I think the Russian support for Trump is because Trump is somebody who once attacked the U.S. electoral system 4 years ago. He's clearly, it's another topic if you want to get into it. There's clearly a plan to do it again in case he loses. He's somebody who repeatedly and frequently attacks American institutions, media, any kind of organization that does transparency and accountability. And all of that is of interest to countries who want to see the United States become less cohesive and in order to have a foreign policy of any kind, whether it's in Europe or Asia or the Middle East, the United States has to have a cohesive political system. And if we don't, then we, eventually there's so much chaos at home that we retreat from the world. That, by the way, could be one effect of electing Trump.
so what do you think that our institutions are strong enough, 4 years after the challenge to the election result, to withstand it if we go through something similar again?
So I think the fact that Trump is the candidate again shows that there's something profoundly wrong with our institutions. I mean, regardless, I'm sure there are some people voting for him on this call. I mean, but regardless of what you think of the Republican Party, or regardless of your critique of the Democratic Party, and there are many good ones, or if you don't like Harris and so on, I mean, Trump is somebody who sought to overthrow a U.S. election. He did so in using both lawfare as well as violence. He did so in a planned and careful way. He was clearly the leader of that process, and yet he didn't pay a legal price for it. And at the very, very end, I mean, it almost went unnoticed. A few weeks ago, Jack Smith, who's the special prosecutor who's investigating January the 6th, came out with some charges. But I mean, in the months leading up to an election, that's not the time to do it. I mean, why wasn't that done in the first year? Why wasn't it done in 2021? And so the feeling that he wasn't held to account and that somehow he got away with it, I think has affected people quite profoundly. And that leads people to question, well, if he didn't pay a price for it, maybe it wasn't that bad. So I think we've already had a kind of failure of the system in that sense.
Let's go to some viewer questions. David Goldberg asks, if Trump is reelected, he'll be a lame duck from day one. Is it possible to see that status is a significant restraint on his potential to do irreparable damage in U.S. foreign policy during a second term?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't predict how Trump will behave, but I would think on the contrary, that him being a lame duck means he doesn't have to worry about being reelected. I mean, unless he decides to try and stay in office, which I wouldn't exclude either, by the way. But no, I mean, it might mean that he feels unconstrained. And remember also that he's now much more elderly than he was the first time. And he will also be surrounded by people who are much more willing and interested in enabling some of his worst instincts. He will be surrounded by people who are more interested in what I described at the beginning, which is state capture. So using, whether it's the Department of Justice or the FCC, or the FDA, using some of those state institutions for political purposes. I mean, there will be more people around him who want to do that and who know how to do it. So I'm not sure he'll be more constrained either domestically or internationally.
But of course, there will be multitudinous lawsuits that'll be filed attempting to hem
will
him
be.
in from every
There
direction.
will be multitudinous lawsuits. There will be a lot of things will happen. I mean, and actually, as I said, I have two fears about Trump. I mean, they're not so much about political repression, although maybe he'll try that. I don't know, but they're about, first of all, chaos and the system just becoming gummed up and nothing it's not possible to do anything. And I'm also concerned about corruption. I mean, really high level corruption, whether it's the regulatory agencies or whether it's through giving power to Elon Musk. I mean, there are all kinds of different scenarios. I'm worried about the federal government being partially privatized. You can imagine the Department of Energy or the Department of Agriculture or the Department of the Environment being given over to people who want to use it for their own business purposes. And that is something that happens, by the way, in these populist autocratic regimes. That's what's happened in Orban's Hungary or in Erdogan's Turkey. When you have that kind of decline, when you have state capture, and when you have the politicians taking over the state and using the institutions of the state for their own purposes, you very often have really profound corruption. And that's
Just a quick question about Orban, just because I'm not familiar, some of our viewers may not be. How long did it take Orban? I know this was a process, but did it take a while early on in his tenure to start amassing the kind of power and doing away with constraints on him, or did this happen almost instantaneously?
No, Orban moved very, very slowly, actually. And he did so within the context of the European Union, where he made a lot of attempt to preserve the appearance of legality. He changed his constitution multiple times, but he did so. Initially, he had a constitutional majority. Later on, he fudged it a bit, but he tried to do things in a legal way. The concern actually, if Trump is only there for 4 years, is that people might try to do things in a less legal way, or they might try and do things quickly. I had the experience of living in Poland. We had an autocratic populist ruling party from 2015 until last year, and they did when they were first elected. It felt almost like a coup d'état. They unconstitutionally changed the composition of it's called the Constitutional Tribunal, but it's essentially the same thing as the Supreme Court. And they did it really through fiat. It was illegal. But it proved impossible to stop them. And that was done very fast.
Okay.
So, there are things he could try to do quickly. Yeah.
E.A. Smith in Santa Paula in Southern California asks, how much more dangerous or likely is it that the Ukrainian war could escalate into a nuclear conflict now that North Korea has committed troops to fight on Russia's behalf, especially given that Trump has said he'd tell Russia to do whatever the hell it wants if Trump wins?
So, it's pretty clear that Putin does not want a nuclear conflict and hasn't wanted one. He uses the threat of nuclear war as a way of deterring us. But he's been told pretty clearly by us, actually, that there would be severe consequences. I think I know the Chinese, both in public and in private, have also told him that they don't want a nuclear war. And he's very dependent now on China for trade and for components and other things. So I'm actually less worried about him starting a nuclear war. I would be more concerned about this event somehow being used to trigger a conflict in Korea. There is a lot more tension right now between North and South Korea. The North Koreans have recently upped their rhetoric. They've started talking about instead of talking about the South Koreans as one people, they talk about them as aliens and enemies. They've been blowing up bridges and things on their side of the border. It may be that they feel empowered by their relationship with Russia, and that they start some kind of conflict. So I'm actually that's the new scenario that concerns me more than a possible nuclear war in Europe, which I think is still pretty unlikely for the moment.
Phil in Arizona asks, for many people as old as me who know much about World War II, the term fascist makes us think of the Nazis. Do you find the use of fascist versus authoritarian to be a useful term?
So I actually don't use the word fascist. And I just wrote a book called Autocracy Inc., Autocracy Incorporated, which is about this network of dictators. It's about Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and how they work together. And I didn't use the word fascist at all, except I think in the beginning when I'm talking about Mussolini. I don't like it for the reason that the caller said, which is that it conjures up a vision of the 1930s and goose stepping and Nazis and uniforms, and it makes us think of movies we've seen. Whereas actually the threat of modern authoritarianism is going to look different, and it will look, as I said, it will look more like Orbanism than it will look like Nazism. So instead of mobs on the street, there will be the undermining and taking over of state institutions. There will be using the FCC to take away broadcast licenses rather than Kristallnacht. I mean, that's what I would say. I mean, one could eventually get to street violence, and that's also not unimaginable anymore in America either, I don't think. But the threat is something different. I mean, it's true that I should say, Trump goes out of his way, and some of the people around him are clearly doing it too, to use 1930s language. I mean, he used an expression about immigrants poisoning the blood of the nation. I mean, nobody says that except Hitler. I mean, it's very hard not to use the language when he's using it, or he talks about vermin, or he talks about, enemies of the people or enemies of the state. I mean, that's actually Stalin's language more than it is Hitler's. But he keeps using these terms and that are from that era, and which are not typical in U.S. politics. And I wrote a piece for The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago in which I looked it up. I looked for other presidential candidates who've used that kind of language about their opponents or about anyone, and I couldn't find it. I mean, not at least in the last 100 years. And so he's really brought this way of speaking into the U.S. And so I understand why someone like General Kelly or General Milley would use that term fascist, because they're hearing, they've read history books and they're hearing Trump, talk like someone from one of the 1930s fascist states. But myself, I've tried not to use the term. I use it if I'm asked. I'll talk about it if you want me to, but I use the word autocrat.
Judith says countries with recent slides into autocracy, Russia, Turkey, Hungary, all had a relatively short period of democracy after many years of authoritarian governments. What, if any, differences might there be given the U.S.'s much longer experience with democracy, and how that would affect the possible success of Trump's plans for a more authoritarian government here?
I mean, one of the mysteries of the current moment is why, we have this kind of threat to our system at a moment when not only do we have, 250-year experience of democracy, we also have a great economy. I mean, I accept that it's not great for everybody, but it's certainly moving upwards. One of the best stock markets in history, low unemployment. We're certainly, it's a very different place from 1990s Russia, for example, where, the system had fallen apart and people were living in terrible poverty, and different from, from Hungary with its shorter experience. So I don't have a good explanation except to say that the techniques and practices of autocratic leaders do work, and they seem to work in advanced societies, and they seem to work in even in the United States. And I'm not sure that our 250-year experience protects us.
Okay.
I mean, maybe it will. I mean, there are people who are a lot more optimistic than me. Certainly, there are divided views, for example, about if there is an attempt to steal or block the election, if Harris wins next week. It's pretty clear the Trump campaign is preparing an argument about what, there are a series of possibilities that they'll try to block her becoming president. And I know people who think it's rubbish and it can't happen, it'll all be fine. And I know people who are really worried. So, I don't know. I mean, it did happen. Just don't forget, it did happen 4 years ago. It hadn't happened like that before. And as I said, at least some of the people who carried out the attack on January the 6th now feel empowered. They feel they did something right. And Trump talks about them as hostages, not prisoners. And so that history is already being rewritten.
I'd like to get a couple more questions in, but we're very, very tight on time. So if we could do this briefly. Steve says British Chancellor Rachel Reeves this morning announced Britain will increase defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, more than meeting the NATO goal of 2%. Particularly if Trump's elected, do you think other NATO members will step up their contribution to the 2% or higher level?
That was already happening. That's nothing to do with Trump. I mean, that's to do
Okay.
with the feeling of genuine threat. Poland is now at 4%. So it will, that's already in the, Reeves didn't announce that today because of Trump. I mean, she announced it because of the war in Ukraine. That's already on its way.
Lori and a number of others have asked, what could, if he's reelected, President Trump, do unilaterally when it comes to Ukraine? Is there anything he could do in terms of support or arms, or for anything he does, would it require congressional approval?
I mean, there's a lot that he can do. I mean, he can simply, he can verbally say, I won't help Ukraine anymore. And that will have an effect on the battlefield. I mean, it will change the perceptions of the war. The Russians will say, oh, okay, that's it, we're going to win now. And I mean, the American president has an enormous amount of power just by what he says. And so yes, I think he could
Okay.
change the course of the war very quickly if he wanted to.
We've had a number of people ask, what would the differences be in relationship with Israel and support for Israel between a Trump and Harris administrations?
That's hard for me to say because I don't know what is meant by support for Israel. I think that it's true that the Harris administration would probably, like the Biden administration, seek to contain the conflict. So for example, you saw Israel struck Iran a few days ago, but in a controlled way that didn't create a further chain reaction. They did, and I'm guessing because I don't know who would be her Secretary of State, and I don't know who would be her advisors on this, but I imagine her following a line like that, seeking to contain the conflict and promoting peace. I don't see her making a radical change, cutting off Israel or vice versa. I mean, with Trump again, because he's transactional and because he's interested in himself and so on, it's hard to know what he would do. Part of his support does come from evangelicals who, and some actually Jewish groups who do want to see an unlimited support for Netanyahu, whatever he does, which is, by the way, a lot more than what a lot of Israelis want. So whether that would be reoccupying Gaza, absorbing the West Bank into Israel, taking over parts of southern Lebanon. I mean, that may be his, I can imagine him allowing that agenda to go forward. And I can also imagine that agenda creating a lot more conflict.
Let's wrap up, if you wouldn't mind, Anne, just giving us a closing statement about where you see us at 6 days ahead of the election and what you think we need to be focusing on in these final days in the presidential race.
I would have people, focus on what you can do. Focus on being part of a campaign, being part of a get out the vote campaign. Focus on participating in, being a poll worker, if that's possible, wherever it is that you live. There are a lot of really good organizations that are working to protect the vote, to ensure there's no violence after the election. I mean, find some of them, support them, read their messaging. There's a group called Protect Democracy, for example, which has a lot of programs along those lines. There's another one called All Voting is Local. I wrote a piece a few weeks ago called The Citizen's Guide to the Election. A lot of those links to those groups are in there. I mean, make sure that you feel you're connected to a lot of other people who also want to protect and maintain democracy. And remember that you can always do something. You can always be useful. Whether it's through donations or through being aware or through talking to people if you're not able to physically participate. Make sure that you're part of it and that you don't feel isolated or apathetic, because that's when autocrats win.
Thank you, Anne, so much. I think one thing we can safely say is no one watching tonight is apathetic. They've been hanging on your words and wanting to hear your analysis. And we thank you so much for bringing it and for giving us a lot to think about tonight. We really appreciate you being with us on America to Crossroads.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being your invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne Applebaum, and thank you for viewing our program this evening. We remind you these free programs are only possible because people like yourself are supporting them with tax-deductible contributions. This is a very lean organization, really done with tremendous volunteer support and work to bring these programs to you. Please contribute at JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org, tax-deductible nonpartisan organization. Next Monday on election eve, it's election 2024, the last word. Monday night, political scientists Lynn Vavreck of UCLA and Norm Ornstein, a frequent contributor to prominent publications. They'll be in conversation with Pat Morrison. That's Monday, 5 o'clock Pacific of next week. Thank you so much for joining us. From all of us at America to Crossroads, have a great evening.